edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dale Wolkenstein here with you from the LA Football Network. Today's show, of course, being brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, Aura, AG1, Mint Mobile, and Rock Solid Sports Memorabilia. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein. I hope everybody is, at least in the California area, staying dry out there. A lot of rain coming down. And in this particular sense, for our Monday episode, the rain is definitely coming down with our very special guest today in a good way, because Dan Wolkenstein, once again, working the phones. Great things happen when that takes place. And without further ado, Dan Wolkenstein, if you would, as you always do, please tell everyone who the special guest of today's show is.
Yes, the man, the myth, the legend, the one that all Chargers fans go to for the latest scoops and the insider information on all things Los Angeles Chargers. The Athletic's Daniel Popper will be joining us here on Chargers Unleashed. We'll talk about Justin Herbert, the coaching staff, the management staff with Joe Hortiz. We'll talk about draft and free agency, all kinds of stuff with Daniel Popper. This is a great episode. Really excited for you guys to tune into this one. But Jake, before we get to that, got to pay the bills. Let's talk about our friends.
I want to remind everybody that the easiest way to get into the action of the NFL is Underdog Fantasy and their pick'em game. Just pick higher or lower on your favorite or least favorite player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Just pick between 2 and 5 players to fill out your pick'em entry. Get every single pick right and take home some cold, hard cash. Just make sure to use the promo code UNLEASHED and get your first deposit doubled up by over $500 by Underdog. Tell them Chargers Unleashed sent you.
Without further ado, Daniel Popper joins us next on Chargers Unleashed. Well, happy Monday to Chargers fans. Hope everybody had a dry weekend. I know it's going to be a little wet for those of you out here in Southern California, but to kick things off, to heat things up here in SoCal, we have the one and only Daniel Popper from The Athletic joining us here on Chargers Unleashed. We'll talk all things Chargers, but before we get into that, Popper, how you doing, man?
Doing great. Appreciate you guys having me on.
Of course. A nice way to start the Monday, a day ahead of the Joe Hortiz press conference. Talk a lot about the Chargers and the staff. We'll talk about Joe Hortiz and Jim Harbaugh. Obviously, the possibility of Jesse Minter, draft expectations, and propping up Justin Herbert. Jake, my friend, take it away.
Daniel, I was really curious just because now, obviously, with all of the after effects of the Jim Harbaugh signing, this whole coaching culture change, if you will, happening with this Chargers organization. You've seen this organization shift a few times now between Anthony Lynn to Brandon Staley. And the front office always kind of said the exact same thing when they made those hires, as far as we're going to change the culture of things. This person X is going to come in and change this dynamic. And we heard some similar statements of John Spanos when this coaching search began. And now that we have gotten to the point where Jim Harbaugh is the new head coach, Joe Hortiz is now the new GM, do you finally believe, from your opinion, your point of view, what you've heard, that the Chargers have finally become comfortable in letting Jim Harbaugh and Joe Hortiz take control of the reins of this franchise?
Yeah, certainly. I think, like, more than anything, what this hire indicates is like a real commitment to winning. And that's not saying that that commitment wasn't there previously. Like, obviously, like, they wanted to win and they knew how important winning was toward making an imprint on the market, growing the fan base, all the things that are important to ownership from, a business perspective, frankly. But this is different because you're going out and you're getting, like, arguably the best coaching candidate in my opinion, the deepest, group of coaching candidates in recent NFL history. They paid for him. They made the commitment to him, beyond just the contract that they gave him, allowing him to, build the infrastructure with the staff, agreeing to, commit the type of resources that are necessary from a facility standpoint, food for players, all of this type of stuff that maybe the layman fan doesn't think about, but that's important towards building this idea of culture. Like, all of those things are really important and indicate like an elevated commitment to winning. I think that ownership like certainly feels that this is a really important point for the organization, right? Like, you're entering your 8th season in Los Angeles. you've had, 2 playoff appearances, 1 playoff win since coming to LA, but haven't really made the type of run that's going to turn heads in this town. And like you need sustainable winning in order to, really carve out your place in the market. Um, and like that's what this shows. And I think like I don't think that they were like meddling or anything like that with Anthony Lynn or Brandon Staley, but I think that going out and getting a coach of this caliber, paying for him and agreeing to give all the resources that are necessary, I think in many ways, like it does feel like a very refreshing vibe, around the entire organization and a real determination, to get to that point where you're winning sustainably and where you're like genuinely contending for Super Bowl titles.
Now, we saw the Ravens contending for Super Bowl title. They came up a game short to get to the Super Bowl, lose to the Chiefs. But Joe Hortiz comes to the Ravens, 2 decades of experience there. A lot of people have talked about like his successes with drafting and personnel and kind of understanding what it takes to win in the NFL with a player perspective. But to you, like what stands out most about Joe Hortiz that could actually impact how things are done here in LA with Chargers? And then I guess as a second one, like how do you see him working with the others on the management staff alongside presumably JoJo Wooden, Ed Maguire, and obviously Jim Harbaugh?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that jumps out is just that familiarity with Jim Harbaugh. Like that to me is like the most important thing about this hire. Now, like as Jim Harbaugh said at his press conference, I don't think they have some like long history and sort of deep seated relationship, but obviously Joe Ortiz has that with John Harbaugh, Jim's brother, and Jim said pretty explicitly that there's no one in the world that I trust more than my brother. And like that matters. So like if John Harbaugh is saying to his brother, "Hey, like I trust this guy. This guy knows what he's doing. You're going to work well with him." Like that really matters because if it doesn't work out, like there's only one person to blame for that because it worked out obviously with John Harbaugh in Baltimore. And I think having that kind of environment is really important to making it work because as much as Jim Harbaugh wants to stand up there and say that things went swimmingly in San Francisco, like there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. Not saying that it's on him, but like that's something that you have to consider when you're building this thing as an organization. I think coming from the organization that he's come from and the way that they built teams, tough teams, good offensive lines, physical at the line of scrimmage, like all of the type of things that you want as far as building a football team. And frankly, something that was missing over the 11 seasons of Tom Telesco. He made efforts to build through the line of scrimmage, but was unsuccessful for the most part, in doing so. And that was a big reason why they haven't been able, to build sustainable success. And so, like, I think those two things are really important to me, right? Like, you have that familiarity there. So you feel like the partnership is going to work from a personality standpoint. And then you're talking about a guy that was with an organization for 26 years. Like go look at the people that have worked under Ozzie Newsome. Like that, those are the people that are in the conversation for GM jobs every year. The way they build their teams, their approach to team building, their success in the draft. Those things are obviously what you want in a GM candidate. And it's going to be interesting to see. Like, I thought it was kind of interesting. Like, I pressed Dean Spanos and John Spanos a little bit last week on like what the power dynamic is and who has control. I thought it was noteworthy that they wouldn't really commit. I think we all on the outside can sort of deduce what the power dynamic is with the way that the hires went down, as it should be, right? You're going out and getting Jim Harbaugh, let him run the show and let him do what he needs to do to build the team that he wants to build. But they kept saying it's going to be collaborative, and like to a degree, like I think on the outside we probably put a little bit too much on like who has final say because like if you're getting into constant arguments over players, and that's that's not going to work out in the long run. Um, and so like the way that they framed it is that both guys are reporting directly to John Spanos. That's different than it was previously. So like that in itself is a change in structure because it was Tom Telesco reporting to John and then everyone beneath him. So to have that kind of different dynamic where both, head coach and GM are reporting directly to ownership, I think that will, go a long way towards cultivating that kind of collaboration that they're trying to instill in the organization. So like those three things are my biggest takeaways as far as like how they set up this pairing.
Now, I will say that I'm curious. Well, first off, do you think JoJo Wooden stays?
So yeah, let me get to that. So basically, like when these hires go down, the GM isn't going to come in and at this stage, like in February, like 3 weeks ahead of the combine, like tear down the entire scouting staff and the front office. So typically what happens is you hire a GM, you keep that front office and scouting department and personnel department mostly intact so that you can use those resources, that you still have your scouts on the road, that you're not doing all this turnover, ahead of like all of this stuff that's happening draft wise. And then typically what would happen is you do the draft, and then in those couple months before training camp and sort of into the season, you
Uh,
sort of like gradually sort of turn things over, bring in your own scouts, that type of thing. So I don't think it's a sure thing that JoJo Wooden is necessarily going to stick around. He will be here. He was down at the Senior Bowl, and I think that the staff, as it's currently constructed, will sort of get the team through the draft, and then I think you could see after the draft, um, some changes. But Ed Maguire will remain in his role. Like he reports directly to ownership, and like he's obviously the Chargers cap guy, contract negotiator. He with Tom, he used to do most of the communication with agents. So he's going to stay in that role. And obviously, like I think you guys are well aware, like he does a very good job with the cap. Like um, there's a reason the Chargers are year over year, like among the lowest teams in the league in terms of dead money. Like a lot of that is because Ed does a great job in terms of structuring contracts and manipulating the cap and those types of things. So he will remain in his role. He's kind of separate from the head coach GM pairing. So I believe he will stay as VP of player administration and player finance. But the rest of the staff, it'll probably be some turnover, once they get through the draft.
Gotcha. Now, I think Chargers fans are all in a frenzy. I feel like we're at Six Flags with this roller coaster of emotions Chargers fans are on right now with this Greg Roman speculation of if he's going to be an offensive coordinator, a member of the staff, a senior member of the staff, an assistant, who knows? What's the latest that you're hearing with Greg Roman specifically? Like, what should Chargers fans be bracing or expect if he is or is not the offensive coordinator?
Yeah, like I see it all. Frenzy, I think, is an understatement. Like, well, here's the advice that I would give Chargers fans: take a deep breath. Okay, you have Jim Harbaugh as your head coach. Okay, national champion Jim Harbaugh,
Talk
44,
to him.
19 and 1 as an NFL head coach. All right, clear vision for how he wants to play offensively, defensively, special teams. Clear, proven evidence of building a team both at the college and pro level. Okay. So, like, for now, like, give this guy that you're paying reportedly $16 million a year the benefit of the doubt that he's going to build a staff and that he's going to get the most out of Justin Herbert. Like, I know that the natural reaction from you guys is to like immediately assume that everything is the worst case scenario and that, Greg Roman is going to be offensive coordinator and Justin Herbert's going to have an ADOT of 3 yards. Like, but like, let's cross that bridge when they get there. All right. Have a little bit of faith that this guy understands what he has in Justin Herbert, that he also understands, right, that like the process of the previous regime of saying, okay, he's brilliant intellectually, he has every tool in the box. Let's put as much on his shoulders as humanly possible because we feel like he can handle it. Maybe that's not the best way to get the most out of Justin Herbert. Maybe building a running game will be valuable. Maybe taking some off of his shoulders will allow him to flourish. So I'm not going to get ahead of anything right now. Like all signs point to Greg Roman being on the staff in some capacity. We'll see how it shakes out. But like I've never covered a coach that has this type of pedigree, these types of skins on the wall. Like I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt as far as building the staff, building the systems, until I see otherwise. And that's sort of where I'm at with it. So I would just tell everyone to like take a deep breath. It's gonna be okay. Like the hard part's done. Like I know you guys are
An
constantly
extension
wanting.
of an extension of that.
Yeah, just calm down, everybody.
Yes, absolutely true. Yes. Kind of an extension of that, though, with Greg Roman. Just when you talk about the other coaching hires that we know and this offensive staff starting to take form, and we know obviously the expectations on the defensive side of the ball. The one coach that we've heard, just as far as the old regime goes, that we know for sure with the expectation of being retained is Ryan Fitkin. And Dan and I had this conversation just a couple weeks back that, again, maybe this goes into another aspect of control and power that the organization is giving Jim Harbaugh to build out his staff of guys. Do you see this as just a complete overhaul to the bare bones as far as a absolute rebuild with the rest of the staff? Because obviously, you have Smith now departing. He was one of the longest tenured coaches of this team. Kellen Moore, obviously going to the Philadelphia Eagles. But do you see this as like a complete and total rebuild from the top to the bottom as it relates to the coaching staff?
Yeah, for the most part, like the way it's trending is that the only holdover is going to be Ryan Ficken. Now that still has to be like finalized. But, obviously, like, they blocked his interview with the Giants. I think we've all seen what Ryan Ficken has done with this special teams group. He's obviously like an elite coach. And I think like keeping him around is obviously like the best and most logical choice. So they're working through that. I think like elsewhere though, like, yeah, I think you're gonna see like a lot of new faces, a lot of coaches that Jim Harbaugh is bringing in. Like, I think when you hire a guy like that, you want to give him, you know, control. You want to give him the resources to go out and build the staff that he thinks is going to be best for the organization. And I think like you sort of pick your spots, right? Like I'm sure that they had, good relationships with coaches. Like I know they thought very highly of Kellen Moore, but like you pick your spots. Like if we're gonna go in there and say, hey, this is the guy we want to keep, we want to do that one time. We want to make sure that the guy that we're advocating for, we feel really strongly about. You don't want to go in
Right.
there and try and say, well, let's keep this guy and this guy and this guy. Like if you feel like, okay, out of all these guys that we feel like we're good coaches in the previous staff, who's the one guy that we're going to go in there and really fight for and really advocate for? I think for ownership, that's Ryan Ficken. And I think that's what's happened here. And so like you do that, but everywhere else, I think you give, you know, Jim Harbaugh control and give him the resources and tell him go build this thing the way that you want to build it.
Now, the part that I find kind of fascinating here is like with the new staff, and you're hearing some of these names come out. You're hearing like Mike Devlin and Andy Bischoff and Marcus Brady, all for the offensive side, possibly coming in. We know Ryan Fink, we are just talking about Jesse Minter, I think, is a huge piece that I think is underrated with how much of an impact he brings to this team. But looking ahead to like free agency and the draft, and I know you put out a piece about like free agency, at least currently, Chargers aren't really going to be keeping any of them. But like in terms of free agency and the draft moving forward, how do you see like the staff, and whether that's the assistants, whether that's Harbaugh, whether that's Minter, or whether that's Joe Hortiz? How do you see those kind of new faces affecting the draft and free agency?
Yeah, I think a lot of it sort of starts with what they do with the roster, what they do with this cap situation. I think you sort of have to start there because those are the first decisions that they're going to be making here. If not this month, then early next month. So you sort of have to decide like what's the timeline? What timeline do you want to be on? Are you going to do everything that you can to be competitive next season, or are you going to look at the roster a little more realistically and say, hey, like let's tear this thing down to the studs and then let's rebuild. So as far as free agency, a lot of it's going to depend on how much cap space they have. Like if they do, they keep Keenan and they keep Joey and they also keep Khalil and they cut Mike Williams, Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, then like you're looking at
Not
pretty
much.
limited cap space, right? Like you're really, managing and navigating this thing and you're going to go into free agency with, very limited room to really operate in free agency. Now, if you go the other direction, what I've called like the rip the band-aid off timeline, right? Like let's say you extend Keenan and trade Joey and Khalil and cut Mike. Now you're looking at a little bit more cap space, and now you can really go be very active in free agency. Um, but like either way, and I wrote this in my story for today, like there's a lot of needs. Like I was going into it, writing that roster needs section, being like, all right, let me rank like the usually I rank like the top 3 most important roster needs. Like I started going through it and I was like, honestly, like there's literally one position that you have nailed down and that's starting quarterback. You know, obviously left tackle as well. But like if you sort of group tackle together, like you could certainly draft a tackle at 5 and look for an upgrade on Trey Pipkins who had a down year um, in 2023. So like in that sense, like when regardless of what they do with the cap situation, that's going to affect free agency. But in terms of the draft, they can really go in any direction that they want. Like you could see an entirely new running back room. You could see an entirely new tight end room. You could see an upgrade at tackle. You could see an upgrade at guard. You need a starting center. If you move on from Bosa and Mack, you're going to need an edge rusher. Both your linebackers are probably going to be off the roster. You have one corner that you feel good about. You need a safety to start next to Derwin James. Like I can go on the list. You need speed at receiver. Like I can go on and on. I think that's everything.
Ah,
So like But in a sense, right? Like if you're bringing in a new regime,
Kind of a good thing.
you got a new head coach and you got a new GM. There's a really an ability for them to mold this thing the way that they want it, to find players that fit into the schemes that they're going to be running. Um, Now, with the draft, that leaves a lot of possibilities as far as where as you go. I think that's a good thing, when you have a new regime. Now, the free agency aspect of it is going to depend on sort of how they view this thing with the cap situation. Are they going to try and retain a majority of the four? Are they going to retain two of the four? Are they just going to retain Keenan? That's the biggest when you're talking about roster construction with this team right now. That's the biggest question because they do have options. They do have as I wrote a couple of weeks ago, they have a lot of options as far as how they want to go about this thing, especially now that hey, like this is like a reimagined like way that the organization is operating. In the past, they've refused to do void years on contracts. Like you can go look at every contract they've signed
Totally.
since I started covering the team. They've never used it. I think
Do you know why?
initially,
Do you know why they haven't used it before?
yeah. um, I think initially it was something that, obviously, like when you put void years on a contract, you're running into dead money. And I think like early on in the Tom Telesco tenure, like avoiding dead money was, a big principle. I think towards the later half of the Tom Telesco era, I think like, you look over at how the Eagles use void years. You look at how the Saints use void years. You're like, hey, this actually might be like a decent mechanism for us to use to maybe try and, you know, you know, expand the windows for certain iterations of the roster. And that wasn't a a route that they decided to take, largely because of the dead money, implications. But with this new regime, with this change in vibe, like anything's on the table now. So like you could add void years to these contracts and push a bunch of money down the road. Now, like what that would do is create less flexibility for 2025. So if you do rip the band-aid off, then you're looking at an ability to really reset this thing for 2025. And to me, that's like the most logical way to go about it. But at the same time, like Khalil Mack was unbelievable last
So
year.
good.
Like I literally I think I wrote this, like literally the best non-Justin Herbert season I've ever seen from a Charger. Like he was dominant. And so it's like could you convince me to like, even extend him or add void years to keep him on the roster for 2024? Like, I don't think that's a bad decision. It
Right.
all depends on what the timeline is. But overarching point is that I think every mechanism is on the table now. And I think the way that they're operating, a lot of those like ways that we kind of like would interpret how the team is going to operate, I think you can throw a lot of those things out the window because of the new regime.
Okay, quick follow-up. Popper Damas here. I'm putting you on the spot here for a second. Last thing we have
Damas.
on draft stuff. You can coin that phrase for your hops with pops later.
Okay.
Chargers fans are all talking about draft stuff, and we don't know the future of the edge rushers or the receivers. But all things being considered, what we know now, what do you see the Chargers' first two picks position-wise being if they
Yeah.
stay?
It's a good question. It's hard to see a scenario where an offensive lineman is not drafted in the first 2 rounds. Like that would be like my big prediction. I feel pretty confident about that. Like they have some pieces, right? Rashawn Slater, obviously stud at left tackle. I've seen some good things from Zion Johnson. He obviously has the physical tools to be a really good player. He hasn't lived up to his draft slot yet. Um, but I think he's going to be fine. Like, I don't know if he's ever going to be like an elite starter, but I feel like he could be a solid starter at left guard. I think they're going to feel good about him. Um, Outside of that, it's like, I've seen good football from Trey Pipkins, but last year was a step back for sure. I don't know if Jamari is really going to work out at guard. Like I thought that move would be more seamless than it was. And then obviously you have a huge hole at center. Like you need a starting center. And so like considering where that position group is at, considering the philosophy of Jim Harbaugh and both like what we know about him as a team builder and what he said explicitly in his press conference, I feel like those first 2 picks, there has to be an offensive lineman taken, whether that's a tackle in the first round, whether that's looking for your starting center in the second round, something like that. That would be my guess. That they're going to really invest in the front.
So then what would the other pick be? I'm not letting off the hook because that's the one I think a lot of Chargers fans are like, "What are we doing?"
Yeah, I mean, anything, right? Like you tight end, you could go running back, you could go edge rusher, you could go wide receiver. Like I think you could do anything. But again, like right, I think if you move on from Mike and Keenan, that changes
Totally.
what the need is at receiver, because then you're pretty much bare in there. Think Josh Palmer's a good player. I don't know what Quentin Johnston's going to be. So right, but like if you keep Keenan, then it's like, all right, maybe we go later rounds, day 3 receiver, that type of thing, right? Like, or even if you do keep Keenan, you might still look at pick 5 and be like, hey, look at what happened with Jamar Chase and the Bengals, right? Like, so yeah, I think I would say definitely an offensive lineman there at some point in the first 2 rounds, and then I listed the roster needs, so nothing would surprise me after that outside of
Chargers fans will be up in arms if they go running back in the first 2 rounds. Say that much.
That's it. Yeah. I mean, I agree. Like positional value wise, I think like there's an argument to be made that you shouldn't draft a running back that high. But like, man, this team needs like a
It needs
stud.
it. Yeah.
They do.
Like they've needed a stud running back. Because Austin's a great player, obviously, but he's not like the strength of his game is not running between the tackles. And so like, I think he put up a ton of production, but when you look at like why didn't the running game, turn into a strength of this team, like there's a lot of different factors that went into it. Some of it was coaching, some of it was scheme, some of it was personnel up front. Some of it too is what they have at running back. And like as much as the positional value thing gets discussed, like a stud running back does change how you run the football. Like that's just the reality of it. So again, like, nothing would shock me. At this point with the way the roster is constructed and what they have, no pick would surprise me outside of me taking a quarterback,
Well, Jake, maybe they'll have the monopoly money to go get Saquon Barkley after all.
We'll see. This is not a big year for spending, that's for sure.
I don't
Exactly.
know. I don't think you're gonna need. Yeah, I don't think you're gonna need monopoly money to go get Saquon. I mean, just the free agent running back market is wild. Like, I think you can sit on that and probably get a very talented back for like a very reasonable contract. I mean, that's how everything's been shaking out over the last like 2 years.
I agree.
Sure.
Daniel, I wanted to flip it over to the defense. All expectations, as Jim Harbaugh had said, they're still going through a process and bringing Jesse Minter on board, but that is the expectation that he is going to come on and be part of this defensive staff. I wanted just to get your opinion on this because obviously with roster turnover that we're expecting with this team, not a lot of money to spend in free agency. Obviously, you had mentioned Jim Harbaugh and Joe Hortiz having to hit big time on the draft to really be able to compete to 10 in 2024. And I think everybody would agree that the defense for this Chargers team has been probably the most underwhelming unit over the past 3 years. So in Jesse Minter's defense, a lot of people have said, okay, this is going to get Derwin James back to the play style that he has always dominated, that we've seen him do in previous years. But I guess if you were to pick one other position or out, maybe I think we know from the trenches standpoint, that's what Jim loves to build up. But whether it's a player that you think that would benefit out of this new defense the most or a position group, essentially, what is your kind of like 50,000 foot view of what Jesse Minter is going to bring to this defense?
Yeah, I mean, I think Derwin's like where you got to start, right? Because Brandon Staley came in and had like this huge, grandiose plan for how he was going to use Derwin James, and like when he was talking about it, like it was very exciting, right? You're like, okay, Derwin's going to be the signal caller in the huddle. He's going to be the leader of the defense. He's going to be playing safety. He's going to be playing money. He's going to be playing star. They're going to be blitzing him off the edge. He's going to be this queen on the chessboard that they're going to use all over the place. And like in theory, it made a ton of sense. And like there were a lot of good things that came as a result of moving Derwin around that much. But it never materialized into him playing his best football. And I think by the end of it, he all that they were asking him to do just put so much stress on him mentally from a preparation standpoint, even from like a play to play, like just to get into the specific. I know you said 50,000 foot view, but just to dive into the specifics of Derwin, right? Like let's take 2 plays, for example. One play he's, playing deep field safety, and the next play he's playing slot corner, right? Those 2 positions are wildly different, right? One position, everything's in front of you and you're attacking forward. The other position, you're basically, a hybrid linebacker. You're at the line of scrimmage, the angles you're taking are different. The routes you're covering are different. The way your body's moving is different. And so, like, yeah, you have to understand everything mentally, but you also have to get your body to be able to do those two different things on two different plays right next to each other. So all of that factored in. And then you had the penalties early in the season, which obviously for an aggressive player like Derwin James, like that's going to be a factor when you're already overthinking and you add that to the mix. So like for me, that is priority number one. Like
and the teammates, I don't want to interrupt, but and the teammates that he's playing alongside of in those two specific plays. Like you're dealing with your safeties and corners versus like your linemen and linebackers.
Right. Completely different. All of that. It's a great point. And so like that to me is like when you're talking about like, okay, who are the players that you're talking about? Like that's priority number one, right? I think play style wise, Derwin James fits into exactly what Jim Harbaugh wants to be. Aggressive, physical, energy, right? All of that kind of stuff. Like I think Derwin James embodies that. But how do you get the most out of him? And, I think you can look at him as a player and look at his skill set and be like, oh my God, look at all the different things that he can do. Right. But it's similar to Justin Herbert, right? How do you maximize him? Is it making him do all these different things and taking on all of these different responsibilities? Or is it maybe shrinking that a little bit to try and see, okay, these are the three things that he does really, really well. Let's sprinkle in obviously some variation, but like, let's get him playing his best football. The other thing defensively is like, the corner plan never really worked out. That was a huge part of why the defense never really came together under the previous regime. I think you had like really good stretches for Michael Davis, right? Like I think the back half of 2022, probably the best football he's played in his career. Then he comes back and he doesn't have a starting spot. They're trying to get JC Jackson to a starting spot. They're like, oh, maybe we'll get all three of them on the field at the same time and play Mike and JC on the outside, and we'll put Zont in the slot. Zont doesn't really want to play in the slot. He views himself as an outside corner. Eventually, they go with Jasir Taylor. That doesn't work out. They're rotating.
Like PTSD over here.
Michael Davis is playing 40% of the snaps, and then all of a sudden he's in there on a crucial play in the Titans game. He gets beat over the top. He can't get into a rhythm at a position that's predicated on getting into a rhythm. And so like, and then obviously like, we don't have to dive into the JC situation fully, but like that never really materialized. So like, I would say number one, get the most out of Derwin James. And then number two, like figure out a plan at corner, like figure out what it's going to be, figure out a group that you can really rely on. Like the one thing that I talked about a lot with players during the Staley era was like, there's just all these moving parts. And like when they were playing good football is when they set a lineup. They had the same guys going out there, and they all were really comfortable with what they were playing. And they were able to shrink things down and not be playing, 900 different coverages with, 900 different, checks and calls and disguises and all of this different stuff, right? So those would be the two things. Like when we do get a chance, if Jesse Minter, ends up being the defensive coordinator and we talk to him, like those are the two things that I would really focus on. It's all back end related, but that's where the NFL is. How are you going to get the most out of Derwin James? And then what's the plan, at corner? Those would be my two big things.
We'll wrap it up here with Daniel Popper from The Athletic. Last one for you, Popper. I want to talk to you about Justin Herbert because Jim Harbaugh talked about him as the crown jewel, one of the crown jewels of the NFL, him and Derwin James, Sean Slater as well. But how do you see kind of the new staff, whether it's propping up or supporting Justin Herbert? Like we know kind of the trials and tribulations that he's had and the successes he's had in spite of a lot of that. But with kind of this new staff and this new style of football and the new head coach, like what does that do for Justin Herbert? How do you see him kind of being supported or kind of propped up in this kind of new era of style of offense?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that's been missing more than anything else is like a reliable run game, and to have that is such a security blanket for a quarterback, especially this past year. Like it was a disaster. Like they just could not run the football. And like, I don't want to bring it up, but like go back to Jacksonville, right? Like that, if there's one thing that I could like point to as like a clear indication of Herbert's career, like, yeah, he missed that touchdown throw to Keenan Allen. And like, maybe if he makes that throw, things go differently. But like, we're talking about like a big reason why that all unraveled there in Jacksonville. Like they couldn't run the ball in the second half, and then they hired Kellen Moore to replace Joe Lombardi to, create a running game. That was the big thing. Kellen Moore is going to come in, he's going to be able to scheme this thing up, and they're going to have a running game. And it was worse than it was at any point under Joe Lombardi. And so, like, yeah, is he special? Absolutely. In pure passing situations, he can get it done. But in order to like really get the most out of him, he needs some semblance of a running game. And he's never really had that in his NFL career with the Chargers. So what does it look like when they can really run the football, when that can be a strength of the team? And you also have this alien quarterback back there. Like, what does it look like? And how much can he sort of get to that next level when he has this other facet of the offense that he can really rely on? Like that to me is what's going to be most interesting about, this new style of football that they're going to be playing under Jim Harbaugh.
Yeah, I mean, Justin Herbert covers up a lot of bad. And you mentioned this past season, the running game, like how many 3rd and 1s, 3rd and 2s, 4th and 1s that they could not convert via
Even
the ground.
first down efficiency, right? Like how many 2nd and 10, 2nd and 11, 2nd and 9? Like it's different when you're 2nd and 6, 2nd and 5, and you're able to run the football. Like it opens up everything. And then when teams have to respect your running game, they have to deploy more resources to the line of scrimmage. That creates more one-on-one opportunities. That creates less shell coverage. Like all of it's related. And so, like, I'm a big proponent of throwing the ball. It's obviously the most efficient way to play offense. But you can't just not have a running game. Just like it's not going to work. It doesn't matter how talented your quarterback is.
It's amazing the optics and how perspectives of quarterbacks can be. And like you see a quarterback who doesn't have to throw it that much, but the running game's so good and he looks so great because the offense is efficient. But then a quarterback like Justin Herbert, who has to throw it 80% of the time, he'll get dinged because he has to make these throws because he doesn't have running game. And how different those look. But it's like it's not the quarterback's fault that he can't convert anything other than via the air. So
yeah. And also, like, okay, how does your offensive line look, right? Like if the opposing team knows you're throwing it all the time and you're in 2nd and 9 on every single series, how many more pass rushing opportunities do they have? How many more reps on an island is your left tackle and your right tackle going through? Like a running game will help the quarterback. A running game will also help your offensive line and pass protection. Like it helps everything. And like there's, as much as people want to throw their arms up and lose their minds about Greg Roman, like the one thing he's going to be able to do is like scheme up a legitimate running game. And like we have not seen Justin Herbert play quarterback with a reliable running game at any point in his career.
It's amazing the things that that Chargers fans can complain about when in reality, like it would be nice to have a running game. And if that means Greg Roman is the guy that's doing it, so be it. He's not going to butcher Justin Herbert. And you also have Jim Harbaugh at the helm who's going to make sure that stuff gets done the way it's supposed to get done. Daniel Popper, man, the myth, the legend. Appreciate you coming on. Tell the Chargers fans what you're doing, what you're up to, what they can find out about you next.
Yeah. So I got a fun story coming. Hopefully, not next week, but the week after. I'm not going to reveal too much, but it may be focused on the 1999-2000 seasons. Maybe.
Ooh.
Maybe. That's all I'll say. Nothing more.
Okay. Love it. I love it. Daniel Popper, you can find him on X, on The Athletic, obviously. Does incredible work. Highly recommend Chargers fans going in, obviously subscribing to The Athletic and following Daniel Popper and the work he does. Popper, you're the man. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you soon. Have a good one, all right?
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, guys.
Of course.
Thanks, Daniel.